So here we are. It's our second week of Advent. And it almost seems impossible to me that Christmas is just a few short weeks away. It seems so unreal that we're getting closer and closer to celebrating that joyous birth of the Christ within each and every one of us. Now, last week we heard Reverend Jan speak about the call from within to become something greater than ourselves. That call from within to move us into a greater understanding of the divine power and the divine nature that each and every one of us are. And during her lesson, she shared a little bit from the Gospel of Luke. And there was one part in particular that just really stood out for me in a way that it hadn't stood out before. Now, it's a familiar story, and it's one that I'm sure many of you have heard several times. In it, the angel Gabriel, this is from the first chapter of Luke, and the angel Gabriel appears to the Virgin Mary. And he tells her that she's pregnant and going to give birth to a child, a holy child, the Son of God. And Mary, being a virgin, is understandably shocked and amazed. And the first question she asks is, well, how is this possible? I'm a virgin. And Gabriel responds by telling her about another pregnancy, by telling her about her relative, Elizabeth, who's pregnant with her sixth child. And here's why this would have caught Mary's attention. Because you see, Elizabeth wasn't supposed to be able to have children to begin with. And Elizabeth is quite a bit older than Mary. And so Mary's kind of wondering, is this possible? She doesn't seem like she's young enough to have a child. So the angel tells her about this pregnancy and then says, "For nothing will be impossible with God." And then Mary said, "Here I am, the servant of the Lord. Let it be with me according to your word." And then the angel departed from her. And what stood out for me wasn't the idea that anything was possible with God. It wasn't that don't worry about it, anything is possible with God, because, well, that's something we see over and over again in our scriptures. We see it over and over again in stories about God. We have Jesus telling us that anything is possible to those who just believe. If we look at the story of Hanukkah, of the first Hanukkah, we see the same sort of theme, that anything is possible with God. We have the Israelites lighting a fire. It was an eternal flame that was supposed to burn to honor the eternal fire of God. And when they lit that fire, they knew that they only had enough oil to burn for just one night, but they went ahead and lit it anyway. And then the story goes, the oil lasted them 8 days, which was how long it would have taken them to make new oil to keep the fire burning. So we know that anything is possible with God. That wasn't really what stood out for me, because that's always been very little question in my mind, that there's anything possible if we turn to God. So the part that struck me as standing out, that just struck me differently this time around, was how quickly Mary surrendered. It was how quickly Mary just let go and let God after the angel told her about Elizabeth. Immediately her reply is, "Okay, well, let it be with me according to thy word." And we look at the Bible symbolically here in Unity. We teach that the stories of the Bible can serve as symbols for us in our lives. They can serve as symbols for our own spiritual development. And they can provide us with guidance and with tools for increasing our own connection with God. And the story of Mary immediately surrendering to God is absolutely no different. It gives us a spiritual tool for how we can access the divine wisdom that's present to us in every moment. It shows us not just how we can, but how we should respond to divine ideas when we receive them, and how we should make them a part of what we are, just as Mary made that new life that was growing inside of her a part of what she was. So it kind of gives us that idea. It gives us that tool. And our co-founder, Charles Fillmore, what Charles Fillmore believed was that the angels, when they appeared in the Bible, symbolically, they represented divine ideas. And that Mary symbolically represents the soul. And so for Mr. Fillmore, when he looked at this story, what he saw was a representation of what happens when we get a divine idea at our soul level. And so for Mr. Fillmore, his belief was that our work then became expressing as many of these divine ideas at a soul level as possible. Because as we began to express more and more of these divine ideas, it would make way for our own manifestation of the Christ nature. And the story reminds us that as a divine idea shows up, that we too, just like Mary, should surrender to God when we receive those moments of inspiration. We should allow God to be God within us. We have to get out of the way and allow God to become the allness of God within us. We have to let go of control. We have to let go of the need to control and simply say, okay, God, let it be with me according to thy word. And that's the part that's so hard to do. I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel like I have a fairly good understanding of the idea that God is all good in the world around me. And I feel like I also have a pretty good understanding that if God has desires for me, that those desires are ultimately for my own good. Yet when I'm confronted with something, when I'm confronted with some sort of life situation or some sort of change, I don't want to let go. I want to be the one that's in control. I want to be the one that's making the decisions. I get that God is all good and that God's desires are only for good in my life. But man, I have a hard time remembering that when I'm faced with a life-changing decision. And so if we believe that God is all good all the time, and it follows that God would only want good and growth and understanding in our lives, and so we believe that God is working to ensure that that good is happening in our lives. We believe that God is working through us to bring about that growth in our lives. And oftentimes in unity, we refer to that working of God as divine order. And so what I wanted to do was really explore the idea of divine order, because I'm going to be honest with you, this has sort of become one of our unity cliches. Something bad happens in the world around us, something happens in our life, we don't really understand what's going on, so we affirm that divine order is active. It's okay, divine order of God is working in and through that situation, it's okay. But what are we really talking about? What does it mean to affirm that that divine order is active? And so I took a look at what Mr. Fillmore had to say, because I thought surely our co-founder, Charles Fillmore, is going to have the definitive definition for what divine order is. So I looked in my copy of the Revealing Word, and I pulled it out, and I went to divine order, and I read where it said, order is the first law of the universe. Indeed, there could be no universe unless its various parts were kept in perfect order. The facts of spirit are spiritual character, and when understood in their right relation, they are orderly. Orderliness is law and is the test of true science. Okay. Didn't really help me out like I was hoping. But I get that the divine order must be God's will. It must be God's order. So it must be the order of God that shows up as love, as peace, as hope, that shows up as each one of us. That must be the divine order we're talking about. And then I think of the times when I was facing a difficulty, or the times when I had to make a decision. And it seemed like so many times when I was making that decision that I was doing what was God's perfect order in that moment. It felt like I was following the divine order and the wisdom of God that I was getting, but I never got the results that I was hoping for. It never quite worked out the way I thought it would. And let me give you an example of what I mean by this. Before I worked here at Unity Church of Overland Park, I worked at Science City at Union Station. I actually started working for Science City the very first summer they were open. So although right now it is a wonderful place, it's a wonderful science museum, have all sorts of great exhibits that come in there, it took them a while to grow into that. They had kind of a rocky start. They did that thing where it opened up and there was all this excitement and they brought on way more staff than they needed. And then they realized they weren't quite going to bring through 3,000 people every day, and so they had to start making changes. And every time they would make a change, I'd get upset. They would announce they were going to lay off staff, or they would announce they were going to restructure, or they would announce that, well, we're no longer going to do this program. And so I'd get upset, and I'd think, well, okay, that's it. I'm going to find a new job. I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to move on. And so let me see if you can realize what it is that I was leaving out of my process of looking for another job. Because what would happen is that they would announce a series of layoffs. They would announce a restructuring. I'd get angry. I'd rush home. I would log on to monster.com. I would start looking through the job listings. I would find things that I was maybe qualified for this and maybe not. Sure, I have event planning experience, so I would send them a resume. And I would just hope that I would get something back. So I'd send out all of these resumes. Sometimes they'd call me. I'd get an interview. I'd go to the interview. I'd come home and think, wow, I did a really great job on that interview. Surely they're going to call me. And they would call me and tell me that they'd offer the job to somebody else. And then I'd get disappointed and sad and start feeling rejected. And then I'd repeat this process over and over and over again. And you see, what I realized I'd forgotten as I looked back on this was that I'd left God out of it. I'd completely left the presence of God out of this job hunt. And for some reason, it took a shock to get me to remember that I needed to turn to God first. Now, eventually what happened is there was one restructuring too many. There was one too many layoffs, and circumstances finally got to the point where I said, I can't deal with this anymore. And I walked in and I gave my notice and I said, oh yeah, and by the way, here's my 2 weeks notice. And if I remember right, I have 2 weeks of vacation left, so I'm also giving you a vacation request for 2 weeks at the same time. Today's my last day. And I quit. With no job to back me up, with no security blanket in place, I just quit and left. And that night when I came home, I did something that I haven't done before. I hadn't done it before. I prayed. I turned the entire process over to God. I surrendered myself to God and looked at my career and my career path and said, okay, God, you take charge of this. You do your work through me. You guide me to my next right and perfect place. And as it turned out, once I turned that career over to God, it was about a day later that Reverend Bob called me into his office and let me know that there was an adult education position that had just opened up. And would I be willing to do that on an interim basis? You see, what I realized through this whole thing was really something amazing. After all of those years of trying and applying for jobs and getting rejected and sitting there going, what do I have to do to move on in my life? What do I have to do to get out of this dysfunctional working environment? What I realized was that what I really had to do was just turn it over to God in the first place. I had to go into prayer and center myself in God and let God do what God was going to do through me in the first place. You see, I had to realize a way of trusting God, of trusting that that presence was going to work through me to bring about my own good and to bring about my own next right steps. And so you see, when we're faced with a significant life decision or a change or some sort of shock, we simply have to get out of the way and trust that every moment, every single moment is being properly prepared in harmonious arrangement for our own greatest good. And so how do we live our life by this divine plan? Well, the first thing we have to do is accept it as a truth that there is such a plan to begin with. And then by making this plan ours through affirming our oneness with the omnipresent of Spirit in which that plan exists. So we claim the truth. We claim the truth that I am the offspring of God, that I am one with God's perfect wisdom, and that wisdom is now ordering my life in divine harmony and divine health. We ask for wisdom. We affirm divine order. We put ourselves in unity with the Spirit. And the truth is that God's perfect order exists. It exists independent of whether we choose to access it or not. So our work becomes not to bend the will of God to what we would like to do, like I was attempting to do when I was applying for job after job after job. Our work isn't to bend God's will. Our work is simply to get out of the way and let God do what God does through us. And that's the part that is so hard to do.
How few the things that can be done by might. High aims are thwarted by excess of will. Only when thought is free can mind take flight. I do not have to press, but to be still. I fish, but it is God who fills the net. I dig, but it is God who fills the well. Life is not mine to order, but to let its living power flow through me and impel me forward. Would I grasp infinity? I cannot, by hard striving, reach the goal, but I can let the infinite use me and know my instant oneness with the whole. I cannot find you, God, by seeking far, but I am quiet. And there, God, you are.
So with these words from his poem, Not by Might, poet James Dillett Freeman reminds us of the truth that although, yes, we need to surrender to God in all things, that doesn't mean that we don't have our own work to do. And remember his words that although it is God who fills the net, it is God who fills the well, I am the one who digs. I am the one who fishes. It's up to each and every one of us to take an active role in our spiritual journey. Always remember that the fifth unity principle reminds us that knowledge of these spiritual principles, knowledge of these spiritual truths is not enough. We must live them. We must live our lives from the place of knowing that God is in charge. And so let's explore a way that we can do just that. Let's look at a way that we can begin to truly live our lives from a place of knowing that God is in charge, that knowing that God is our strength, from knowing that when we get a sense of inspiration, we can say to Spirit, yes, let it be with me according to thy word. And in doing so, we can trust that God is moving in us to bring us to our higher good. We know that in surrendering to God, we allow the presence of God to move through us and to bring us to the right solution to whatever it is that we're facing if we can only get ourselves out of the way and let God be God in us. And one of the things that I've always found true in my life is that when I affirm something, it always seems to bring about a change in my mind. Now, it doesn't always happen immediately. Sometimes it takes longer than others, but it always happens. And what I've learned is that the more I begin to affirm something, it begins to become a part of what I am. And so, as you move individually towards that joyous birth of whatever divine idea is being birthed in you this holiday season, I would like to encourage you to affirm that no matter what step you're being called to take on your journey, that God is your safety in every circumstance. Affirm that God's voice speaks through you in all situations, and you are rightly guided in all circumstances. The presence of God within you is guiding you to how to call upon its divine strength and its divine protection in all moments. Affirm that there are no exceptions to what God can do because there are no exceptions to God. And affirm that you are forever connected to that limitless power, that limitless strength. You are forever connected to it now and forever. Affirm that God is strength, and in that strength I trust. And as we continue to affirm these things, as we continue to know that these things are true in our life, the more and more we remember to turn to God when a struggle comes up, when a decision comes up. When we're faced with something, whether it's an obstacle or a goal or even just a new step on our spiritual journey, remember the words that were written by poet James Dillett Freeman. Remember when he wrote, "I cannot by hard striving reach the goal, but I can let the infinite use me." And the more we remember to do that, the easier it becomes for us to respond to any situation, to any concern, to any call to go deeper in our understanding of God's power by listening to Spirit's guidance and simply saying, "Here I am, Lord. Let it be with me according to thy word." And God bless you all.